Welcome to today's virtual summit, Continuing Threats to Free and Fair Elections. My name is Matthew Weil, and I direct the Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. This event is the culmination of several months of collaboration between BPC, the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU, and Harvard's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. We wish this event wasn't necessary. The 2020 election saw the highest turnout of eligible voters in a century, during a once-in-a-generation global pandemic. Election administrators, including all of the ones you will hear from today, performed admirably under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. They deserve our respect. Instead, election officials nationwide report emerging challenges that can undermine elections for decades to come. Those challenges took on a new flavor last year. Election officials faced real vitriol and personal threats against themselves, their employees, and their families. They weathered partisan attacks and threats to undermine their independence. Many of those who served honorably in 2020 are considering leaving the field altogether before the next presidential election, and some already have. That is the context in which Brennan, Ash, and BPC decided to collaborate early this year. Where can policy solutions mitigate these new worrisome realities of election misinformation? What are the ways to support election administrators and build capacity for the future? Is there a role for the federal government when it comes to protecting those who are responsible for providing all of us the fundamental right to vote? I promise to minimize my time on the screen today so you can hear directly from our rockstar panelists. I also want to preemptively thank all of the panelists and the moderators you will hear from today. I encourage you to listen to their stories, hear their experiences, learn from their proposed solutions. Now I want to turn the event over to Larry Norden, the director of the Election Reform Program at the Brennan Center. We'll talk briefly about the work we did before launching us into the first panel. Larry?
Thanks, Matt. And thanks to you and BPC for hosting the event today. And I also want to thank all the participants today. I'm going to say something, I'm also going to keep it short, but I want to say something that shouldn't be controversial with the group that's watching today, but that is worth saying publicly as often as we can. Election officials and workers are the unsung heroes of every election, but particularly the 2020 election. In the face of a pandemic, a flood of disinformation, and cyber threats from hostile foreign nations, states, they managed to run an election with the highest turnout in over 100 years, and one that has been called the most secure in American history at that. Today, the United States is facing an unprecedented attack on our democracy, and it is no accident, given how important they proved themselves to be last year, that election officials used to working in the background, the referees and not the players, are a central target of this assault. Nor is it an accident that the attacks on election officials have come from domestic as well as foreign actors. Our adversaries abroad understand just as well as the enemies of democracy at home how critical our election officials are to free and fair elections in the United States. As Matt said, the work that went into today was a collaboration between the Brennan Center, Bipartisan Policy Center, and Ash Center at Harvard. Over the course of 3 months, the organizations interviewed well over 40 election officials from over 20 states, as well as many other election experts in putting together what ultimately became our recommendations and analysis of the current situation. The Brennan Center also conducted a national survey of election officials with the Brennan Strategy Group this spring, asking election officials how they themselves are experiencing the current crop of threats. From all of that work, the Brennan Center and the Bipartisan Policy Center together put a report called Election Officials Under Attack: How to Protect Administrators and Safeguard Democracy. The report not only attempts to paint a comprehensive picture of the challenges election officials are facing today, from death threats to disinformation, to political interference and how election officials do their jobs, but also in looking at solutions, recommendations for how we can fight back against this assault. The past couple of weeks, I've been really heartened to see a growing attention to this issue, including from allies like the California Voter Foundation and news organizations like Reuters. I do want to say what's new in this work that we've completed, aside from the national survey that I mentioned, is the very detailed set of solutions at every level. Those solutions are critical. If we're going to protect our democracy, we must find a way to protect election officials and election workers. That's going to require a whole of society approach that includes federal and state legislatures and agencies, prosecutors, law enforcement, and social media companies. Most importantly, those with the power to do something should consult closely with election officials and workers themselves. There really is no exaggeration to say that the survival of our democracy depends on this. With that, to delve into the challenges that election officials are facing, as well as what can be done to address them, I'm going to turn the discussion over to a man who really needs no introduction, Matt Masterson, non-resident fellow at the Stanford Internet Observatory, formerly, of course, CISA election security lead and US EAC commissioner. Matt, thanks for leading us off today.
So what I'm going to do is briefly introduce our panelists and jump right into the discussion so that we can hear directly from those that have been working on this. So our first panelist is Natalie Adona. She's the Assistant Clerk, Recorder, and Registrar of Voters in Nevada County, California. Natalie specializes in election administration. She runs elections, election law, and voting rights research. Natalie's research interests are informed by her practical experience, both as a poll worker and now as an election official across California and the country. She's a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley. I think as a Stanford fellow, I'm supposed to respond to that somehow, but I'll let it go. And the American University, where she holds a JD from Washington College of Law. So Natalie, thank you for being with us. Next is Katie Harbath, who's a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Katie previously served as Facebook's Global Director of Policy Programs in charge of politics and government outreach. Prior to Facebook, Katie was the Chief Digital Strategist at the National Republican Senatorial Committee. And she previously led digital strategies and positions at DCI Group and the Rudy Giuliani for President campaign and the Republican National Committee. So Katie, thank you so much for being with us and for your work on this important topic. Next is Gauri Ramachandran. I hope I did that right. I even practiced trying to do it right. She comes to the Brennan Center from Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles, California. While in law school, she was the editor-in-chief at the Yale Law Journal. After graduating from law school in 2003, Gauri served as a law clerk to Judge Sidney R. Thomas on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in Billings, Montana. She received her undergraduate degree in mathematics from Yale College and a master's degree in statistics from Harvard, and was critical to the work on this project. So Gauri, thank you for being with us and for your work on this report. Finally is Al Schmidt, who's the city commissioner in Philadelphia. He is in his third term as city commissioner. Al's one of 3 members on the Bipartisan Board of Elections, where he serves as the vice chairman. Al is a former senior analyst at the nonpartisan U.S. Government Accountability Office. Prior to GAO, Al served as a policy analyst for the Presidential Commission on Holocaust Assets. Al holds a PhD in history from Brandeis University and a BA in history from Allegheny College. Al has also been one of the most visual or outspoken supporters of the security integrity of this election and was in the storm of many of the threats shared throughout this report. So Al, thank you for your leadership and for being on this panel with us. So with that, we're going to jump right in. I'm going to pivot first to Gauri. Gauri, if you don't mind, can you give us some of the top line findings that we can use to inform this discussion around the national poll of election officials that's a part of this report? What'd you hear from election officials and what should we take away from it?
Yeah, so as Larry mentioned, we interviewed dozens and dozens of local election officials all across the country, and we just resoundingly heard very similar themes from all of them, that they had worked tirelessly, so hard to pull off a successful, secure, safe election in the middle of a global pandemic, often having to work remotely and all of that. And it was just so disheartening to them that, and just stinging that in the face of all of that, they then were subject to, disinformation campaigns, untruths about security of the elections they ran, the fairness of the elections they ran, even though, they're such honest people and dedicated to free and fair elections. And then also actually, physical and violent threats that were coming from folks online, over email, phone calls, all of that sort of thing. So the two of those things together just, packed a really big punch. And in terms of the survey that the Benenson Strategy Group conducted on our behalf, It was a national survey of local election officials, and it found that approximately 1/3 felt unsafe because of their job as a local election official, which is really a shocking number. And approximately 1 in 5 had actually received threats because of their, sort of violent threats because of their status as an election official. So it's really, I think folks have started to hear individual stories from certain election officials in the news in the past few days, but I think those numbers really indicate that the problem is rampant and it's widespread. And so I'm really excited for us to talk about different solutions today and hear from election officials their views on what we can do to move forward.
Gary, thank you. And I appreciate you teeing up the conversation. I'm going to turn to Al and Natalie next, and in sort of an unfair way, ask you to represent your colleagues in the 8,800 local jurisdictions across this country. But as you hear Gary share some of the numbers behind the experience, I wonder if you don't mind sharing both your own experience through this election. Election officials face and don't shy away from both criticism and transparency. Certainly in every election, emotions run high. What was your experience? What made this experience so much different in the rhetoric, the vitriol that was directed your way at your colleagues as well? And how would you encapsulate or share what you're hearing and what you experienced in the 2020 election? So we'll go to Al first and then Natalie.
I would say one big challenge is that normally in an election season, candidates attack other candidates, not attack the election officials who are running the election, unless they've done something, wrong. And that's not the case here. In this last election cycle, there was an effort, most certainly, to make the election administrators participants in all of this, and to suggest nefarious motives. And the threats and all the rest, I think, flow out of that from what is normally a pretty important but obscure position, which is to run elections.
Thanks, Al.
For me, I mean, it's interesting because in a lot of ways, the pandemic shut us off to the public in a certain way, because my office is very small, both in terms of the number of people who work here and the physical space. So, when we invited in observers, we can only invite in a few at a time. When we had early voting, it was sort of in the same building, but separate from where my office is located. So in a way, I was hearing about everything that was happening to my peers in my state and across the country. And, in a way, feeling somewhat removed from it. But at the same time, I have to admit that there were moments I did not feel very secure. So, for example, I would leave the office and sometimes by myself at, 10:30, 11 at night, and look at a dark and empty parking lot and sort of wonder, was this a good idea for me to leave by myself? There was also a moment that made headlines where we had a pop-up rally happen in the parking lot on the weekend at my office. I happened to be the only person here. I knew that it was blocking our vote by mail drop box in that parking lot. And because I was by myself and because I got a sort of very sharp sense that this group was becoming more and more radicalized, I did not approach anyone at the rally. I found myself, sort of taking pictures of the event, but crouching down because I was afraid there was a possibility that someone could see me or my silhouette and sort of know immediately that I was an elections person and that, somehow I was going to interfere with their activities. So in a way, I'm very fortunate to have not personally have been the target of the public's threats, but at the same time, hearing about everything that was going on around me and around the country, I can't say that I wasn't nervous.
Yeah, and I think both Al and Natalie, your reflections are reflected in the report from the survey that was done in the conversations I've been fortunate to have in my work at Stanford. Election officials, even not just in the heart of it, but outside of swing jurisdictions, have faced just sobering and scary threats of violence, insinuations, both online and through phone calls. I wonder, as we all, as the panel reflects on what happened in this election, and then 2022 and 2024. I mean, 2022 is here. We're in it already, right? For election officials, you're already planning, you're already preparing. What changes, either for Gary or Katie, have you heard that need to take place, that are recommended in the report? And then for Natalie and Al, given what you've experienced, what your colleagues have experienced, what operating environment, what operational realities, security realities are changing for you to have to implement, and what do you need to achieve those, whether it's resourcing, support from the federal government, otherwise? So we'll start, I think, with Katie, and then we can just kind of jump in.
Thanks, Matt. I think that one of the main things that looking at is you've got redistricting that's still going to happen, and that is coming late. And so concerns about helping to make sure people have accurate information and understand that it's going to be okay if maybe they're voting in a different district than what they voted in 2020, helping them to understand what that process is going to be really important, in addition to understanding what the new rules are, given all the different legislation that is passing in these states. I think could potentially be quite confusing for voters who were already confused in 2020 and will feel even more confused in 2022. So I think there's work that can be done now of working across, tech companies, civil society, the election officials, and others, of thinking about how do we help prepare the American public for what voting in 2022 will look like.
Thanks, Katie.
So I'll jump in. I think in addition to sort of making sure, as Katie mentioned, that, the accurate information about where to vote, what district someone is in, all of that is going to be super important. Amplifying the voices of those who have that accurate information, which is local election officials. They're the ones who are going to be administering those elections in 2022. We also in the report are recommending sort of from the law enforcement side and the physical security side that the Department of Justice actually convene a task force specifically looking at these threats to election officials. Often these threats are illegal, obviously. Intimidating someone, and especially trying to intimidate someone out of performing their job to administer our democracy is a crime. And so we're recommending a task force so that both federal and state law enforcement can work together with input from local election officials and other stakeholders to really put some attention on this problem and make sure that people are deterred from engaging in this activity going forward. We're also recommending that state governments really provide the funding and the training for local election officials to protect themselves, to secure their offices. So folks like Natalie don't have to feel afraid when they're in their small office. So extra funding to make sure that those offices are physically secure, that election officials can protect their personal information online, remove it from public databases, the way that often states allow domestic violence survivors to remove their information from public databases. There's a whole lot that can be done on that side to beef up, the physical security and comfort that election officials have moving into 2022.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. And for Al and Natalie, as you reflect on the question, I wonder if you can also weigh in on what type of support you received from either local, state, or federal law enforcement, what more you think you're going to need moving forward, given these experiences, and what's the appropriate role? What do you need specifically from the federal level that you either got in this election and you need more of, or you simply didn't feel supported that you would like to see more leadership on?
I think after every election, there are lessons learned. And one of the biggest challenges moving forward, I think, is balancing security and transparency. The 2020 election in Philadelphia was held in the Philadelphia Convention Center, which was a completely controlled environment surrounded by a phalanx of Philadelphia police officers on the outside, Philadelphia sheriffs on the inside, and private security also. But at the same time, making sure that election observers have access that they rightfully have to observe our operations in the canvassing and counting of those ballots, which we were able to provide. So I think the biggest challenge moving forward is how do we now harden this target in Homeland Security terminology against threats, and at the same time make sure that we can provide, as we should, access to observers so that they can observe the counting of the votes.
Mhm.
On the federal level, just very quickly, on the federal level, I would say it's less on an immediate security side, because the Philadelphia Police Department, in our case, and Sheriff's Department, was terrific. It's mainly on the investigative side, because they have resources that our city's departments don't have directly. So when there are threats, when there is some sort of chatter about things headed our way, that the federal agencies obviously take those seriously, investigate those, and track those down.
Yeah, and Al, I know, for instance, in Philadelphia, across Pennsylvania, physical security, protective security advisors from CISA were out at local election offices before the election, working on, improving the physical security around those offices. I think, just from my experience, taking what they learned from those individual assessments and compiling it into some advice, some guidance to help local election officials, even local law enforcement, harden that target, as you said, I think would be really valuable. Some data-driven analysis on that. Natalie, I wonder, based on your experience, if you could share, what additional steps you may be looking to take heading into 2022, and do you have what you need to accomplish those things?
Thanks. And, just to sort of bounce off of Al's earlier point, I think that's absolutely correct that, you do need to consider that elections is a very public process. And you can't forget about that when you also think about the security side. Now, I have the opportunity to learn a little bit more about what we need for 2022 a little bit earlier, because California is very likely going to have a gubernatorial recall in 2021, the date of which we will soon know. And, I think that there were a lot of lessons learned from 2020 on the federal side, in addition to the need for funding, which I get. I was very comforted to know that I had the contact information for the FBI local field office sent over to me, along with some brochures on, how to report up situations. But, I was also fortunate enough that our Secretary of State invited FBI and other stakeholders into a virtual county situation room. So in all of the days leading up to the election, we did not have to contact a bunch of agencies 3, 4, 5 times. We could just make one communication and everybody would know what we were going through and could either advise us or take action. So that was really helpful. I think that the state was also really an important player for us, not only with planning the election, but also helping us to get what we needed for security. And, I was also very comforted that they were very responsive to every request, no matter how small it was. And I also engaged with the local law enforcement here. I think that was helpful in a way, but, I also think that, and where we could do better is they didn't quite understand, I think, what how serious everything had become. And I hope that now that we've had incidents like the one that happened at the US Capitol on January 6th, that people now understand what mis and disinformation about elections does to people, and that it does need to be taken seriously. So I have provided recommendations to the Secretary of State for how they can better communicate with the State Office of Emergency Services and other agencies to help better support us. On the observer side, I think that what's going to be important are two things. One, more intense training of my temporary staff. They're not always informed as to the particulars of election law, and they certainly don't know and don't track all of the changes that I do at the sort of state legislative level. The other thing is, what I've been telling my staff and others is the truth is the best inoculant to mis and disinformation. Always tell the truth, even if it is hard for the person on the other end of the line or across the counter to hear. They need to hear it. And at the end of the day, I really believe you'll be better off for it.
Yeah, well said, Natalie. Thank you. We're going to pivot to mis and disinfo and its role in these threats in the operating environment of election officials. I've been asked to remind those that are attending online that you could submit questions through the live chat on YouTube or Facebook or on Twitter using hashtag BPC Live. So please feel free. We've gotten a couple questions in. I know that the folks are tracking those questions. Natalie, you teed up rather well kind of the pivot towards mis and disinfo around this process and the experience for election officials in trying to combat that. And so I'm going to go to Katie with the first part of this question, which is there's obviously we've got tech platforms, Facebook and Twitter are most often cited, but a variety of tech platforms involved in the sharing of information and frankly, a vital part of our election ecosystem at this point, right? Election officials rely on the platforms, but also voters are relying on the platforms for information. I'm curious as to your thoughts, given your experience. What do we do? How do we engage as a community, both election officials, researchers, academia, in working with those platforms to help combat mis and disinfo around elections, but also to empower, to raise the voices of election officials louder, right? So that the information, the facts around the process are most prevalent for those that are engaging on those platforms.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, in 2020, we just saw an unprecedented amount of activity from the various platforms, whether it was a Facebook, a Twitter, or Google, but even Nextdoor and TikTok and Snap, many were all doing a lot of efforts in addition to civil society and the work of election officials that I think it is important to recognize there was record turnout. And for that to happen in a year like 2020, I think a lot of that was because of how much they were working together, but it didn't come without its challenges, as you mentioned. I think that, each tech platform is a little different in terms of the audiences that they have and how they can reach people. Election officials only have so many resources to their disposals and time in order to understand how to use these different platforms. I think there's also a question too that we've been seeing about who is the right messenger and what are the different messengers that are putting out information about not just, the mechanics of voting, what the day is, what the deadlines are for registering to vote, but also around sorry, I lost my train of thought because my Alexa decided to turn on in the middle.
It's no problem. It's no problem.
Right of home panel, so I'm sorry about that. But anyways, I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of there's so many election officials and so many groups who are wanting to help, that how do we help them to not only combine forces and continue to think about working well together, but thinking about who are the right messengers for getting this information out. That's where I was. Because you have, like we've been talking about candidates and elected officials sharing information and thoughts about the validity of different types of voting, about fraud. And I think a lot more work needs to be done around thinking about what are the best ways for helping people to better understand this information. Who are the best messengers that might be at the local level to help get this information out. And so I think now is the time, your point, like 2022 is already here. I think 2021 and these next 6 months are a time to be having those conversations about what worked and what didn't work, and what do we need to start thinking about to be ready, because 2022 is not in November of next year, right? It starts with the primaries. It starts pretty early next year. And so I think we need to remember that in terms of timing.
Thanks, Katie. Al, I wonder, in your experience in Philadelphia, I know at the federal level, the state level, with the National Association of Secretaries of State and State Election Directors, there was a push to constantly reinforce that state and in particular local election officials are trusted sources of information. And yet, despite that, we saw the massive amounts of mis and disinfo around the process that was spread both from the bottom up and top down from larger accounts. I wonder if you could share two things, Al. One is what it's like to be in that hurricane of disinfo across the platforms, and two, what techniques, tactics you used to try to make your voice louder, to push information, and what you might do differently, if anything, as you look towards future elections.
Well, I was hoping that you'd have the answer to those questions, Matt, or anyone else.
Yell louder, Al. Yell louder.
Panel. That's what it feels like, yelling into the wind. Forgive the comparison, but in a lot of ways, misinformation is like a virus, and it spreads and is impossible to contain once it's spread. Every election administrator and everyone involved with elections is running full tilt to count the votes at the end of the day around election time. You have very little time for our, little city department and our team of people to counter every little bit of misinformation that's out there. It is really, I've never been a fan of Mark Twain quotes, but there's some quote about a lie making its way around the world before the truth gets its shoes on, or something like that. That is absolutely true. There was a report that not only had one police officer who died in the line of duty years ago voted in the previous election, but half a dozen others did too. And that got a lot of attention. It was entirely untrue, all of it. Other celebrities from Philadelphia, Joe Frazier, the boxer. It was like Joe Frazier died years ago. He voted in the last election. There was no truth to it at all, but it was everywhere. And, even if we spent all of our day, and we don't have time to do that, countering those sort of things, it's impossible to catch up to it. And it's impossible to counter it. And probably also a little bit like a virus, once it's spreading, you can't stop it. The most important thing, and I think it's one of the main things that I really gained also from reading the report, is that it's really largely also about inoculating people against that misinformation on the front end. So there isn't already a kind of fertile mind for it to take root and grow. Because once that happens, it's too late.
Yeah, well said. I wonder, Gowrie and Katie, I'm going to kind of put you on the spot. And that is, you hear from local election officials like Al and Natalie that, they felt like they were yelling into the wind, that the waterfall or the flood of disinfo was more than because in the end, their focus has to be on maintaining the integrity of the process, counting votes accurately, items like that. I wonder if you could, what more do we need from social media companies, from the private sector to help raise the voices of election officials as we look to, as Al said, inoculate the public and provide them facts now in advance of the next election?
It's great you asked that. What Al just mentioned, that, hurricane screaming into the wind, we heard that over and over in the interviews we did with local election officials. So it's definitely Al, you're not alone in having that experience. And it's so true that, Matt, you had mentioned there are over 8,000 local election officials in the United States. They don't have time, and they're no match for, someone who is elected leader at the national level, spreading misinformation in both traditional and social media. So it's really important that we take the whole of society approach to this. One thing that's helpful, I think, is that, these online platforms, they're really the experts in what makes people engage, what makes people listen, because they're the ones that, have that data. And so it's really on them, I think, to try to amplify and give a voice to local election officials so that people can be inoculated, as Al said, with the truth ahead of time. But I think the platforms can get some assistance. We're actually recommending that a national registry, you'd be surprised, this doesn't exist, just listing, these are all the local election officials. These are their social media handles. These are their websites, right? This is their online presence. That kind of registry could really be put together by other stakeholders like CISA in conjunction with nonprofits like the US Vote Foundation, with groups like the National Association of State Election Directors. If that comprehensive registry is put together, then there's really no limit, in a sense, to what the social media companies can do with it. They could perhaps give special amplification to messages from those accounts in the months running up to an election. They could give special training to those accounts, free advertising, right, on helping to create content so that those 8,000 local election officials aren't just sort of on their own trying to figure out what message is going to get across, what message is going to be heard, how am I going to make this be heard instead of feel like I'm screaming into the wind. So there's all kinds of things that can be done to amplify the truth once these private companies are able to go to a registry that really comprehensively lists who the trusted administrators are across the United States. But it's definitely going to take a sort of all hands on deck approach.
Katie, you've been on the inside, as it were, in those rooms. What did you need, or did Facebook need? Obviously, Facebook did an Election Central, right? Tried to amplify the voices through that. What more needs to be done?
Yeah, I mean, a list like that would be amazing with the social media accounts of those election officials to start. I also agree that I think this does need to be a whole of society approach. People are not just getting this information on social media. They are getting it from other media outlets, whether it be cable, et cetera, radio. And so I think there does need to be kind of a holistic approach and that of looking at how people get information. And I do think that there continues to be a lot of work, and I think social media companies can play a big role in this, of understanding it's not just like what type of stuff gets the most engagement and things of that nature, but what really helps people to change their mind. What helps them, again, I talked about the messengers earlier, but also some of the social media companies tried labels on content to try to give it more context about, mail-in voting and the validity of, and how secure mail-in voting is. But that doesn't necessarily mean just because you put it in front of somebody that they're necessarily going to believe it. It doesn't necessarily just mean that amplifying the content from election officials, unfortunately, means that people are going to believe it. And so I think that continued work of understanding how to help think about behavioral changes for people, and also just help people understand what the role of election officials are. I don't think that many, other than when they do go to vote, I don't think many people even understand there's 8,800 of them and how different it is in different places. And so I think starting earlier on and thinking about how to continue to educate the American public, and if there's a role for social media companies in which to do that in an ongoing basis and not just paying attention 6 months before November, is something that I think should be highly encouraged for all of these companies.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And you actually you teed up the sort of, it's not just November before the election, but in fact, what we're seeing now is post-election time, right? We're months out from the 2020 election, and we're still having these conversations. And so I wonder, I'll start with Natalie and then Al, but get the entire panel's thoughts. With the continuation of the mis and disinfo, with the continuation of the lies around the election, we see an ongoing pervasive campaign to undermine trust even after the results are certified. Everything has taken place. And so I wonder, as you sort of reflect on your experiences as local election officials, what changes, what approaches do you think we need to make either locally within your own jurisdiction or even nationally to recognize and combat, the ability of a loser of elections to just drag this narrative on and drag democracy through the mud on an ongoing basis, even after the election's closed out. So I'll start with Natalie and then go to Al.
Well, so you're giving me the easy question.
Yeah.
What I would say to that is, what I do, or my approach anyway, is to really pay attention to what is making the news right now. And what is making the news from my vantage point are voting systems and the activities that are going on in Arizona that many are calling an audit, but frankly, I'm not quite sure how I would describe it. And for any one of my citizens who calls in or approaches me and wants to raise questions about the 2020 election, one, being very clear about what it is they're asking, and if I am not clear, being very honest with them and say, hey, I don't think that I understand what you mean. Tell me more. The last thing I want to do is dismiss anyone's sincerely held belief that something went wrong and, not make them feel like they're not being taken seriously, because I think that is my duty, to take everyone very seriously and to be very clear on what the law allows me to do, what it does not allow me to do, and be very firm about what our office's posture is on any given thing. And I'll give an example. So recently, I got a call from someone in my county who wanted a forensic audit of the 2020 election. And so I asked him, what is that? Because I literally have no context for what a forensic audit would be in elections. And then proceeded to address some of the issues that he raised. At the end of the conversation, I said, I respect that you have an opinion. I am not, here to change your mind. And at the same time, we are not going to be doing what you suggest because the law does not allow us. And two, we have already audited the election. These were the results of that audit. And there is no reason for me to re-audit anything. Under law, I can't even break the seals on those election materials unless I get a court order. And he was upset, but his question got answered. So, he has many avenues in other parts of the county to express his grievances. I am fortunate that this person has chosen not to, sort of make it personal to me. And he was able, I hope, to move on. That will be my approach for every election. But the truth is, Matt, I don't know. I'm sort of making it up as I go along. I feel like, so, the key things are clear communication, transparency, tell people the truth.
Love that. Al?
I guess at the national level, it started out very encouraging when tech companies running social media platforms began flagging things, right? So there's something that said hundreds of thousands of more votes were cast in Pennsylvania than voters who voted. So the next thing you know, that ends up being something that says this statement is disputed. And I went from being really encouraged by it to like, it's not disputed. It's just simply not true. There's no dispute. It's categorically false and a lie with no basis in fact. So those flags went from being encouraging to almost immediately frustrating. I don't know what else that they could have done, but it was good that they did that on the local level. And by the way, a Republican congressman from Pennsylvania today quoted that in an interview, saying there were 100,000 more votes cast in Pennsylvania than voters who voted. Just totally untrue. I don't know where people are getting this. I don't know if they're choosing to be liars or are really just fools, but it's got to be one or the other because they should know better. On the local level, I think I'm a former auditor for GAO. I realize how important audits are. I'm an election administrator. I realize how important elections are. I might not be a ninja, but what I do know is that Philadelphia will fight all of this nonsense at every step of the way in court. And if they wanted to take us to court, they could. And it's no big thing because I'm confident that we'll win. The elections in Pennsylvania have been audited not once but twice. It's important that we take these things seriously and we fight them before they can get any foothold, when we all know the objective isn't about a free and fair election. We had a free and fair election, and in Pennsylvania, it wasn't even close. It's about eroding trust in our democratic process.
Yeah, well said, Al. Thank you. We're going to turn to audience questions. I'll say, just for my part in that last part, the social media companies, those of us at CISA working with state and local election officials, I think did a fairly good job kind of red teaming out what we expected the narratives to be, the challenges to be around everything from vote by mail to election night reporting to things like that. The area where I just did not anticipate and reflect on a lot is the staying power of it, the fact that it's still going. And election officials in an under-resourced, under-supported profession being asked to fight the previous battle on an ongoing basis while attempting to run the next election moving forward is an impossible task. And we really need to deal with how to support them so that they can move forward with their actual jobs rather than having to fight the battle after battle on an election, as Al said, that wasn't particularly close. The first question, this can go to any of the panelists, so jump in, don't be shy, from an audience member is, who's going to stop these groups from seizing voters' ballots and handling them like's happened in Maricopa County? A couple of you have referenced this already. While there's no one willing to protect these votes and equipment, I would disagree with that. I think state and local election officials are doing everything in their power. I'll just address that, but wondering your reflections on sort of we'll call it the activity in Maricopa County, the exercise, we won't call it an audit, that's taking place, and what we need to do to support election officials, both to share the facts of the election actually being audited already, in some cases multiple times, and then two, to move on and not have this continued attempt to relitigate.
I'll just jump in. My understanding of what is happening specifically in Arizona is, sort of out of the Maricopa County election officials' hands. I mean, when you get a subpoena from the state Senate, you either follow it or you don't. So, I don't know that I would do anything differently in that situation. I think that being in California, we have a sort of very strong presence at the sort of state and local level. So, I mean, I think that we are doing, as you point out, Matt, everything that we can to protect ballots, to protect voting equipment. We have, just a sort of long list of procedures for how to protect ballots and machines and voting systems more generally, and registration systems. So I don't think that it's true that there's no one, sort of really at the forefront here. One thing that I think came up in the 2020 election that does concern me at times is the security of Dropbox locations. There was some Dropbox locations that were tampered with. In my own jurisdiction, I told you before that there was actually people blocking the Dropbox, and they had all kinds of electioneering materials around the Dropbox at the time. And, I think that there are going to be updates to laws to protect our Dropboxes, but, still with some of them being available 24/7, it is hard to have a human being watch them all the time. And it really, sort of calls into question how we protect the ballots that are in there. I think that we have very secure drop boxes, and, people come up with creative ways to sort of do what they do. So I think that is definitely on my radar. We have something around 20 drop boxes around the county because of all the people who vote here in my county. About 90% of those ballots are cast by mail, either by actually putting them in USPS box or dropping them off in a drop box. I would also say that, this is a sort of common, complaint of observers who, always want to know, how we're handling equipment, how we're handling ballots, but at the same time, managed to sort of get their understanding of our procedures wrong. And so what I would say to people is, call the local election official. I mean, for me personally, and I know my peers share this position, we're happy to have you observe any part of the process. You can ask questions, you can learn about everything. That's what I tell everybody. I have yet to have a person who is not used to observing, come take advantage of that opportunity to learn about what it is that we do. But please, come in. I try to share stuff on social media, but it's only really me doing it in my office. There's only 5 of us, including me, who are working on the election side permanent full time. So, I can't get to everybody, but, I do say, come on in. Our process is open. We're not trying to hide anything.
Thanks, Natalie. Anyone else on that question?
I'll jump in terms of these partisan reviews. That's what I'll call them, Matt, that are occurring, like the one in Arizona. I do think it's important that we, lay some blame on those who are actually trying to conduct these reviews. So the state Senate in Arizona is the one that issued the subpoena and handed over ballots to to ninjas who seem to be anything but ninjas in terms of their ability to run a proper secure audit. So we do need to lay some blame for that. In the same way that Natalie, really firmly and patiently explained to the person who called her office looking for a forensic audit, whatever that is, maybe some of these state legislators need to do the same with their constituents when they're getting pressure to conduct these sort of pointless reviews. I think it's important we mention that.
Thanks, Gary. Very quickly, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to ask this. There's a question around what are the reactions from Al and Natalie to the threat of criminal penalties that some states are proposing or have even passed laws against election officials, fines or criminal penalties for technical infractions of procedures, things around ballot drop boxes, particularly given what Gary just said, where perhaps those, or certainly those pushing mis and disinfo have faced very little accountability and now election officials. So any reaction, Al or Natalie, to that push in some states?
I think it's really disheartening. I don't think that it breeds trust in the public in what we do. I also don't think it incentivizes anyone who is, sort of otherwise passionate and, sort of smart and who wants to be able to serve people to actually serve in election offices. It just breeds this culture of being nervous for messing things up. And, it turns out you never really messed up in the first place. I think it's sad. I hope that these laws are reversed.
And I think I can only add to the problem that the report identified, which is the potential loss of experienced election administrators across the country, because with no evidence of election administrators having done wrong, essentially what this is a legislative effort to intimidate election board workers. It's not a threat the way that somebody is threatening you or your family with your physical security, but it's most certainly a threat. It's just, instead of it taking place from an anonymous, text message, it's in the form of legislation. And I think it will unfortunately only add to the departure of experienced election administrators.
Yeah, thank you, Al. So with this, I'll wrap up this panel. I want to thank each and every panelist for your thoughtful responses, for the work on the report, both Katie and Gary and the folks that worked on this. And to Al and Natalie, I'll say to you and to all of your colleagues across the country, what you deserve to hear, which is thank you and gratitude for your incredible work, for your courage in protecting democracy, in serving your voters, which is in the end what your commitment is to, and the thousands of state and local election officials, election workers in the face of a global pandemic, in response to record turnout, did nothing short than heroic activities to ensure that this election was accurate, was secure, and was carried out with integrity. And if we could just reinforce to voters over and over that election officials are transparent, that this process is bipartisan, and that, as Natalie said, observation and participation is available to you. It's why we run elections at the local level, and that those who run elections, as you heard from Natalie and Al today, are professionals. They care deeply about this. They work incredibly hard year round to ensure the integrity of this process. It isn't just something that they wake up some Tuesday in November and decide to do, but in fact dedicate their lives to in order to ensure the accuracy and security. And so the more we can reinforce to voters the professionalization, the transparency, and the absolute bipartisan commitment that folks have, I think the better off we'll be. So thank you to all the election officials out there for your incredible work. And with that, I'll hand it off to Matt Weil, who I think will introduce a short video that was put together. And Matt, thank you for the work on this and the chance to moderate this panel.
Well, Matt stole all my thunder. I wanted to thank the panel, thank the moderator as well. The one thing I do miss the most about having to do these events online, virtual, is that we have no round of applause. I will give you a round of applause. I really appreciate the panelists for joining us today. We are going to continue delving into these topics. We want to talk about the threats to independence and what it's going to take to recruit the next generation of election officials with this new reality. But while we are shifting the virtual chairs on our virtual stage, the Brennan Center communications team has put together an amazing video. And I think that Gary has mentioned it and Larry has mentioned it, but over the past few months, the Ash Center, Brennan Center, BPC have done dozens of interviews with election officials. And I can tell you from personal experience, these were difficult conversations. Several of those election officials agreed to join us for this video to memorialize what happened last year so that it never happens again. And I proudly introduced this video and we'll be back in about 3 minutes.
He will demand the truth, and you will pay for your lying remarks, you liberal lying rhino. We will take you out. Your family, your life, you watch your back.
They had assault rifles.
A pipe bomb.
You're gonna get what's coming to you.
They threatened my life.
Couldn't go anywhere without the police officers.
When we had officers on the roof of our building.
We had go bags ready for my family and my children.
We recognized that the divisiveness in our country was really growing. We also recognized the role that social media was playing.
I had never ever had that before. I'd never had people so engaged and enraged about what we were doing just to ensure that people could vote.
There were people who showed up outside of election officials' houses, armed, people that showed up outside of offices, threatening phone calls, harassment.
And online discussions about types of ammunition and guns to use on me.
It became a daily occurrence outside of our facility to have anywhere from 50 to 150 individuals outside. Some of them were armed.
There was a fence sort of separating the building from the protesters. And they were armed.
We were terribly concerned about every threat, everything that was said, because we just didn't know.
I was encountered with a partisan operative campaign manager with his cell phone, where he videotaped me hurling insults and accusations. It had over 400,000 views. Commenters were saying we should find out where she lives. We should hang her for treason. She should be shot.
This is not what I expect to have to really run and fight for my life.
My son began getting threats that were intended for me.
They're leaving their families and their loved ones to come and do a job that was supposed to be just to count votes or to administer an election.
We actually had record number turnouts of people that came out in a pandemic.
Everything that you had written in a playbook as far as like how you normally do things in an election cycle had to be set aside.
It makes one pause and say, is this really what I want to do?
This to me was an effort to undermine confidence in our entire electoral process.
We think about that happening in other places around the world, but that's happened in the United States. And it's happened specifically because of the big lie.
Election officials are in this for passion, for service.
The public servants all around this country that run our elections at the state and local level, they don't do this job to get rich, and they care more about the integrity of elections than anyone I know.
Thank you again to the Brennan Center staff for putting that together, that excellent video. I want to quickly move to the next panel because I want to have as much time for these panels as possible. The next panel will be moderated by Eduardo Cortez. Eduardo has experience at the state and the local level and the federal level when it comes to elections, having worked for Fairfax County, Virginia, as Commissioner of Elections in Virginia, and at the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Eduardo, the panel is yours.
Hi, like to do the brief intro for our panelists. Aaron Ackerman joining us today. He's the Executive Director of the Ohio Association of Election Officials and President of Ackerman Consulting, a government relations and lobbying firm. He specializes in elections, public utilities, procurement, and healthcare. He received his BA in political science from the University of Dayton. Thank you, Aaron, for joining us. Justin Roebuck is the county clerk and register of deeds for Ottawa County in Michigan. He's the chief election officer overseeing 23 local municipalities and 220,000 registered voters within the county. Justin serves as co-chair of the Michigan Council of Election Officials, as well as the legislative committee of the Michigan County Clerks. He's also a member of the Standards Board of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Previously, Justin served on the executive staff of the Michigan Secretary of State and as a campaign manager for U.S. Representative Tim Walberg, and he's a graduate of Hillsdale College in Michigan. Justin, thank you for joining us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Lisa Danitz. Lisa is an independent consultant and has worked in the voting rights, money and politics, and democracy field as a policy expert, advocate, and lawyer for 20 years. She is joining us here on behalf of the Brennan Center, and her work has focused on increasing election and campaign-based political participation in society through public policy research, litigation, executive and legislative advocacy, and public education. Lisa has extensively published and been a frequent speaker on voting rights issues, including testimony before the Senate Rules and Administration Committee, the House Administration Subcommittee on Elections, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Lisa received her BS from Yale University and her JD from New York University School of Law. So thank you, Lisa. Thank you for joining us today. And then finally, we have Chris Hollins joining us. He's a Houston-based attorney and fifth-generation Texan. Chris earned his Bachelor of Arts from Morehouse College. He completed a joint program with Yale Law School and Harvard Business School, earning his JD and his MBA. Chris is admitted in the state bar in Texas and for the Southern District of Texas and the federal side. And Chris was the interim Harris County clerk and chief elections officer of Harris County, Texas last year. So thank you, Chris, for joining us. We have a great panel, so I want to jump right into it. Lisa, I'm going to kick off with you and talk a little bit about, election officials increasingly are facing pressure to prioritize their partisan interests over a fair democratic process. Can you tell us a little bit about any structural changes that are needed to insulate election administrators during this highly polarized moment? What are some of the things that we should be looking for?
Thanks, Edgardo. Before I launch into the answer to that question, I do just want to highlight that in talking about challenges to the independence of election officials, we're talking about interference with the ability of election officials to do their jobs. And that is a result of a political or cultural shift that occurred in the last several years, where actions that previously had been considered ministerial, like certifying an election that has already been counted, became points of controversy and contention. Areas where people were asserting power because they presumed they could rather than following fair process. So I provide all that as context because I think it's an important recognition when we think about structural changes. There is no silver bullet. The silver bullet would be to fix our political culture, right? But since it seems like that's not going to be an easy fix, structural changes need to come into play. There are a few things that were mentioned in the recent report that was issued today based on interviews with, I think around 40 different local election officials. The one that I want to highlight first is the creation of essentially independent agencies within the states to house election administration. And that type of independent agency would need to have at least two building blocks. First, it would need to have a protected scope of authority at a bare minimum, things like counting ballots and certifying elections that would be free from political interference. And that would need to be combined with a guaranteed baseline of funding to make sure that legislative branches can't interfere to try to influence the counting or certification of ballots and elections. I think that's a really important consideration. It could be modeled on things like the former Wisconsin Government Accountability Board, independent redistricting commissions. Internationally, there are election commissions. There are lots of formats that could be followed. Again, because this is a new issue, there is no exact model to use. Some quick things to reference also that others have recommended. Academics like Larry Diamond, Rick Hazen, and Dan Tokaji have recommended that election officials should be appointed and nonpartisan, as they are in much of the world. And Chris Thomas, former Michigan election director and also part of BPC, has recommended nonpartisan election of election officials.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for that background, that context for some of this discussion and for kind of some of the broad ideas for things we can do that in this space. Aaron, you deal with a state association of election officials. Have you seen, in talking to your members across Ohio, kind of ideas or thoughts around structural changes to insulate folks from the sort of partisan pressure that they've been facing that has really ramped up in the past year?
Yeah, it's interesting, Edgardo. We in Ohio, we celebrate the fact that we are, bipartisan 100%. So we have 4 members on our boards of elections, and there's 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, and the director and the deputy director are always of opposite political parties and opposite of what the chair is. So we really celebrate that bipartisanship, yet at the same time, we're partisan. So it creates some interesting dynamics where you do certainly take off your political hat when you walk in the office at 8:30, and you might put it back on at 5 o'clock or whatever and go knock on doors for your local political party. But you're expected, candidly, as Lisa was saying, to behave in a non-partisan way. So that's the thing that my folks are really struggling with is how do we kind of become non-partisan when we are inherently products of a partisan system? And those are the issues we're trying to grapple with right now.
And Justin, I saw you nodding when the brief discussion on Michigan and Chris Thomas, and so what have you seen in terms of those the need for those structural changes or things to kind of insulate folks? I know Michigan, obviously, you all experienced a lot of challenges last cycle in terms of the threats and the vitriol. Do you have thoughts on what might help there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to echo the point that, has already been made in terms of, much like across the country, Michigan operates very similarly with partisan election officials who are elected on a partisan ticket. Michigan's unique with our decentralized system, similar to Wisconsin, and in the fact that we have municipal clerks, kind of at the forefront of the election process. We have 83 county clerks, but we have almost 1,200 municipal clerks at that level as well. We're on the forefront, and the majority of all of those election officials are elected on the partisan level. So I do think, I think we need some fundamental restructuring of what our actual process looks like, and I really do think we should give serious consideration to Chris Thomas's suggestion, right? That maybe we need to elect our election officials and have them, accountable to and responsible to the voters, but have them in some kind of a nonpartisan fashion. The other thing I think that was mentioned, obviously, in the report as well, but a code of ethics that really is adhered to by election officials, similarly to a number of people in public office or holding positions of public trust where they're relied on for public trust. We need stronger mechanisms for that. And I think we really do, and I know similar to a lot of other states, but in Michigan, county clerks and election officials can donate and campaign for other candidates, and many do. I think that is also a challenge. In many states, we see secretaries of state campaigning for particular, candidates for president, and all the way on down, right, to county and local officials. So I think we really do have to address some simple rules and a code of ethics that can be just adhered to. And I think that also gives protection to election officials in that way.
Thanks, Justin. And Chris, I'd be happy for you to share if you have additional thoughts on that. But as I think about, the things that we saw heading into last November, you were kind of in the, one of many who was the target of a lot of things in terms of the attempts that you were making to utilize what was available to make it easier for voters to access the process. And in response to kind of what you did and what other election officials across the country did to make sure that people could actually participate, there's been a push to kind of to enact new laws this year. We've seen during legislative sessions that include provisions for penalizing election officials for doing their job, basically. What are your thoughts on kind of how that's going to impact upcoming elections? Kind of how those laws weren't on the book last November. I think you were still in court a number of times on some of these issues in that context of trying to penalize what you just doing your job. So can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that and how you think that's going to impact things going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to touch on the previous point, I agree with what's been put out there by my colleagues. When I was in office as county clerk, that's an elected position. You can be a Democrat or a Republican. I chose, although it was not the law, to not endorse anyone, to stay out of partisan politics, and to simply focus on administering the election. Now in Texas, counties have the option, but not but are not forced to enter into sort of a nonpartisan election official engagement. And I served very proudly as the last partisan election official in Harris County. We've now moved to a nonpartisan election administrator, and we were the last of the major counties in Texas to do so. But there are still hundreds of other counties that have partisan election officials. So that's important. But the one thing I was going to touch on is exactly what you asked me. One of the most important things in terms of insulating elections officials is not to have them open to frivolous lawsuits and now frivolous criminal penalties based on potential mistakes in administration, or for simply doing their job too well by making voting too accessible to their constituents, which is what sort of we were on the hook for in Harris County. We were sued dozens of times by deep-pocketed actors who their cases were thrown out over and over again, and frankly, there was no limitation on their ability to do that, and that cost us county resources. It cost us time that we could have been focused more on our job. And ultimately, again, we were proud that 1.7 million people in the Houston area were able to cast ballots and do so safely and conveniently. But there's certainly going to be a chilling effect, what we say going forward, on election officials doing anything outside of the lines to help voters. And that's a real problem. And beyond that, when you put in laws, which are being proposed in Texas right now, to not only penalize the elected or appointed election official, but also the volunteers who serve their community. We had over 11,000 of them in Harris County in 2020. You're not going to have, corporations telling their folks to take a day off to go help their community, because those people could end up in jail and not be available to come back to work the next day. That is a huge problem. And then, of course, the laws that affect the voters themselves. For small mistakes that they could make in trying to vote legitimacy, they risk jail time. And in Texas, there's a distinct case of a woman spending time in prison for a totally honest mistake in voting, and her vote, didn't even count to begin with. And so those laws are deeply, deeply troubling. And I imagine we'll get into some federal legislation discussion going forward. But as any type of federal legislation that's going to protect our democracy needs to address these criminal penalties that scare off voters, but also scare off well-meaning volunteers and public servants from ultimately making sure that we have free and fair elections throughout this country.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, we'll be talking a little bit about federal legislation, and actually, maybe we can kind of pivot to that. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussions in Congress around the For the People Act, HR 1 and S1, but that's kind of in process. But outside of those changes, are there other things that Congress can look at in terms of the short and long term for helping address some of these issues? Because some of the things that you've mentioned have been covered in some of these, in the proposed legislation that's out there. But other things we're kind of learning about and figuring out how to deal with. And so are there, Chris, and I'll start with you since you raised it, but are there kind of other things that Congress can do, regardless of kind of the status of HR 1 for the People Act, to focus on these issues and to help improve elections in the short term and in the long term?
Yeah, well, I imagine others on this panel can speak more intelligently about the details of the laws being proposed. But what I can say from where I'm sitting is that pre-clearance is absolutely necessary when it comes to laws that affect our democracy, that affect free and fair elections across the United States. We've seen how that opened up the doors of democracy for all of our populations from the 1960s forward. And again, bipartisan legislation that was extended and extended by presidents of all political stripes up until very recently. And, I liken this to somebody who's, planning a vacation for their family, but hasn't even put food on the table that night, right? For our folks who are up in DC passing all these laws that are meant to benefit Americans, and of course, folks have different views on what those are. If you haven't figured out the basics of democracy and covered that yet, everything else is going to ultimately fall apart. And so our folks at the federal level, particularly in the Senate, have to figure out how to get behind and support legislation that is going to ensure that our democracy exists tomorrow. Because if we as a country aren't alive, then all those other things that they aspire to are totally useless and will lie, in the wake of the destruction that we've seen over the past few months.
And thank you, Chris. And Aaron, I know you have been as the head of a state election official association, are often part of those discussions around what can Congress do around elections. Obviously, local election officials run federal elections, and so there is some shared responsibility there. And so, can you give us a little bit of insight into your thoughts around what Congress can do, on this front?
Sure. Money. I would love to take Congress's money, and was really disappointed that, some of the good efforts of folks on this call and BPC and at the Brennan Center weren't more fruitful last year, because I think we had a real easy case to make to Congress that we actually needed some resources to get through next year. And, fortunately for us, they came from other sources. But, that's probably another topic we could talk about at great length. But no, I maybe I'm old fashioned. I'm not as interested in the policies coming out of DC. I tend to think that we do run local elections in this country. And I think that the local election administrators know best how to conduct those elections and know what works for their citizens. So I'm not as interested in maybe one size fits all solutions coming out of DC, but I do think that Congress has a responsibility to help us financially to get through these elections. So that's my short answer, I guess.
All right, and Lisa, I know you obviously have worked on federal legislative issues for a long time. So do you have kind of additional thoughts to add on that front?
Yes, I think I would add two things. First of all, while the For the People Act is not necessarily specifically addressed to issues around challenging the independence of election officials, its attempt to provide uniformity in certain processes, say around counting the ballots, how to deal with mail ballots, does provide some level of insulation for election officials in simply following the law and doing things in a uniform manner across the country. I do, in addition, want to echo Aaron's first point, which I thought he got off of too quickly, which has to do with funding. One of the huge issues we found when we did the interviews underlying the report related to the hugely unsustainable workload of local election officials, precisely because election administration offices are staffed very leanly, and there are simply not enough bodies to handle the increasing complexity of election administration. And then, and I promise this will get back to the issue around money. If you look at the example of the 2020 election and you think about the pandemic, election officials had to prepare for multiple elections at the same time with no knowledge of what would really play out. Election officials had to plan for in-person elections. They had to plan for mail ballot elections, right, in order to make voting safe and accessible to people. And there simply were not adequate resources, and by resources, I mean kind of bodies and funding, in order to really make the process safe. In the CARES Act, Congress provided, I think it was $400 million, but that wasn't sufficient, and then didn't go ahead and provide more, and private philanthropies had to step in to fill that funding hole. Now legislatures, as part of this politicization, are prohibiting that private funding from coming in to fund what's really necessary. I mean, again, I get back to election officials are trying to do their jobs, and they're doing it with so few resources. Congress can and really should step in and fix this.
If I could maybe pick up on some of those points that Lisa is making, because I think they're outstanding. Think about, folks like Chris and Justin and how many hats they have to wear just to get through one election. I mean, they're the CEO of their organization. They're in all likelihood the chief financial officer, the chief information officer, the public information officer, the chief legal counsel, the HR expert. They wear all these hats. Those could be positions unto themselves within any election, organization. In Ohio, over half of our counties have 4 staff people or less. 80 of our 88 counties have a population that's less than our 5th biggest county. So it's, so these aren't well-resourced operations as far as personnel and staffing. And to the extent that we can identify those resources and just dedicate people to trying to fill those roles and those gaps, I think would be hugely beneficial for the public and free folks up to, to really focus on the administration of elections, as opposed to having, to work 80-hour weeks for the 3 months leading up to the election and probably 120 hours the week before. It's just not sustainable, like Lisa was saying.
Thank you, Aaron, for jumping in there. And I do have, I want to shift gears here a little bit, because I want to follow up on something that Lisa touched on, but also take an audience question at the same time. And so just as a reminder, you can submit questions using the live chat on YouTube or Facebook or on Twitter using the hashtag BPC Live. And so we will try to get through as many questions as we can today. And so we have a question from Gary Gale, which was for Chris. I think Lisa touched on some of this in terms of standards, but the question for Chris was, are there fairness issues when your county had 24-hour voting and drive-through voting when no other counties in Texas did? And Chris, I know you mentioned in terms of structure, there's also kind of differences in terms of how different counties are set up. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this actually touches on something I was going to mention, based on Aaron's comment a moment ago as well, which is, I believe that democracy should have a floor and not a ceiling, right? I agree with you, Aaron, completely that we shouldn't have one size fits all elections across the United States, but we should have a floor for what democracy means and provide that bare minimum to people across this country. Now, coming back to the specific question there in Texas, a couple of things. One, we weren't the only county to have drive-through voting. We were the one that had a target on our back because we were a large, diverse, apparently, blue county. And so we were the ones that folks reshot their arrows at. But there were rural and urban counties across Texas, a handful that had drive-through voting, and a number of them had extended hours also. But we followed the same laws that they were following. And even now, because the laws in Texas haven't yet passed, there is no limitation on the hours of voting that you can offer. Any county can offer the hours, again, with a minimum threshold that they would like to. And frankly, it wasn't much of a resource issue to offer extended hours. For a county the size of Harris County, which has a multi-billion-dollar budget, to have 24-hour voting for one night, which is all we did. It wasn't 24-hour voting for 3 weeks or anything like that. It was for one night. It cost us about $10,000. That's a very small number for us. To do that same thing in a smaller county, to have one or two locations where you just kept the lights on for an extra shift, would cost them in the hundreds of dollars. And I'm not exaggerating that. And so if they want to offer that to their constituents, they absolutely should. And we encourage it. Our hope was that, we set a standard that other folks would want to emulate. If they don't want to, that's fine, as long as they offer what I believe to be a bare minimum of democracy in their counties. But I certainly don't think we should put a ceiling or a cap on voting access at all. We should highly encourage local jurisdictions, if they want to commit those resources, to do so.
Great, thank you, Chris. And so, to kind of wrap up that discussion around congressional aid, it sounds like kind of a floor for voting requirements, but also funding, right? Those two things go hand in hand, as everybody here, I think, has mentioned. I also want to jump to another audience question from Jen Fuentes. And Justin, I want to turn to you because you talked a little bit, touched on this issue a little bit earlier around partisanship. But the question was really, how do those nonpartisan officials, like as an elected official, how do you remain nonpartisan when you're on the job? Like, how do you actually avoid that partisanship? I think both you and Aaron kind of mentioned this. It is a tricky, right? It's a very tricky thing. And so can you talk a little bit more about how to avoid that sort of partisanship when you're in these roles, even if you're, even if you got there through a partisan process?
Yeah, I think that's a very challenging thing. When you think about the process and the structure we have in America, right, for promoting people through the process of public office. It's difficult. It's difficult for third-party candidates. It's certainly very difficult for independent candidates when there are these partisan structures in place for the offices. And something that Chris had touched on a little bit ago was the fact that he, just kind of made the personal decision not to endorse and not to contribute to political campaigns. And that's exactly what I've done in my role as well. I mean, I feel like the vote counter needs to remain neutral. And I think that's so important. And I think, kind of back to that code of ethics discussion, I think, something that election officials can do themselves is to kind of set that model and that code of ethics. And what I find is that, maybe the people within my political party that I'm talking to don't necessarily like it or agree, but my neighbors seem to really think it makes sense, right? Like when I say, well, I'm the county clerk, I don't endorse candidates, I don't put yard signs in my yard. I think those are things that are very tangible things that just make sense for people on a common sense level. But I do think what would really help to insulate, us as election officials is a little bit more of a broad standard, for our state associations to come up and take more of a leadership role in saying, this is a specific code of ethics that we're requiring people to adhere to, because this matters. I think we have a responsibility of the democratic process to be more neutral.
Thank you, Justin. And I want to pivot a little bit based on that to Lisa and ask, is there a way for outside actors to help defend election administrators from attacks on their independence and kind of help to insulate them? Like, what role do outside actors have in this process. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I think there are at least two different categories of outside actors who can really come in and help and support election officials to defend them in terms of these challenges and partisan pressures. I think the first group of outside actors, quite frankly, are lawyers, right? This comes through in two different ways. First of all, because of the increased complexity of the job that has been discussed already during this panel, there's a lot that election officials need to consider, and they don't necessarily have legal resources throughout the election cycle to consult with. So I think, first of all, there is the possibility of outside pro bono assistance in that regard. And also, when election officials are subject to the kind of frivolous lawsuits that Chris was referencing, pro bono assistance from lawyers can also be quite helpful. In fact, Ben Ginsberg and Bob Bauer wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. It was published, I think, maybe a week ago or so, discussing these issues and referencing setting up a network of lawyers to provide assistance. I don't have any inside track on what's happening with that, but it's clearly getting a lot of attention. And of course, we recommend something similar in our report. I would say the second category of outside actors, and depending on how you define outside, are the state associations that represent the interests of election officials. And I'm sure Aaron can speak to this more, but in particular, one of the issues that comes up is that legislatures very rarely consult local election officials as they're considering changes in policy. And the more that can be institutionalized by consulting with state associations to get input, I think the less partisan influence you'll see, because there will be that input from the front line about the needs of actually administering the elections. So I would say those are the two categories of outside actors that can be helpful.
Aaron, Lisa did just kind of mention the role of state association. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add on that front or not.
Well, we only have 22 minutes left, so I'll try not to take it all talking about state associations and the role that I think they can play. But no, I'm glad Lisa mentioned that. I'm super encouraged. Just in the past 10 years or so, I think there's been a really, I don't know if it's a renewed interest or a new interest in how state associations can be helpful in elections. And I've talked, I'm an executive director of my association. There's a handful of us around the country, and we talk and compare notes. And Pam Anderson has certainly led the charge, and Tammy Patrick's doing some great work. I want to give her a shout out as well over at the Democracy Fund, trying to bring state associations into the equation and how we can be there and be a voice for our members and be that insulating voice as well. So we're very active at the legislature. I mean, there's several election reform bills in Ohio that are going through, and I'm happy to say that I think we've been pretty effective in getting the voice of local election officials heard and considered. That doesn't mean they always listen to you, but certainly, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, as they say. And so just being at the table, I think, is important for local election officials. So yeah, we're proud to play that role, and I'm encouraged to see other states kind of emulating that and starting to get more involved.
If I could just jump in on what Aaron was saying as well, I think that is one of the critical reasons why I personally think it's important for election officials to be elected, because that engagement and interaction with voters is critical. I need to be able to talk to my legislators as a fellow elected official, and I think sometimes that's very helpful because we have the same constituencies. And I think one thing that election officials can do, and I think sometimes we're not always good at this, right? What I like to say is, we're super nerds. We like to dig into the work. We focus on the work that we're doing. Our goal is to do a good job of that. A lot of us have this administrative mindset, but I think something that we need to hone a little bit more are those communication skills and that engagement with the public and with the voters, because our legislators have an agenda, and they are hearing from voters, and we need to step up to the plate as election administrators and also have that same level of engagement and communication with voters, and kind of in giving our perspective and our side and standing up for voters as well. But I think exercising that muscle a little bit more of communicating with a broader spectrum of our constituents, and making sure that we can kind of put ourselves on the same playing field as our legislators is really important.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that addition, Justin. I think it is definitely a difficult thing in terms of the interaction with legislators. I want to turn back to something that I think everybody here has touched on in terms of kind of workload and capacity, and the multitude of things. And we talked about the hope that federal funding comes along with regardless of anything else that's going on, to pitch in. But obviously you all have talked about kind of state resources that are needed, and Chris talked about kind of county budgets. You all have any ideas in terms of creative way, other than the kind of funding issue? Are there other creative ways that you all have come across in terms of adding more capacity to assist as you all are trying to make these elections happen? I know Lisa has looked at this issue kind of across the country, and so Lisa, maybe I can start with you in terms of this question, and then anybody else wants to jump in.
I feel like I need to start the way Aaron did in the last question, where okay, we have 12 minutes left or something like that, because I could speak about this for a while, but I'll try to keep it summarized. I think there have been a lot of ways of creatively creating capacity across the country. So to highlight, I guess, 4 different things. The first is state chief election officials creating a core of backup workers. And I think this has been more something that's been suggested rather than implemented, but basically to create a pool of folks who can be dispatched in jurisdictions where needed. That could be just, helpful staff, or it could be something that Noah Prates recommended. He's a former local election official and a founder of the elections group, and he recommended something called a force augmentation team, where for those areas that require specific expertise like cybersecurity or communication support, or maybe even legal, that the state chief election official could pull together these teams again to dispatch folks where needed. I think the second thing worth mentioning is an approach that Arizona took really successfully in the 2020 election. 2 different programs, one called Democracy Corps, which was a fellowship program, I think mostly pulling graduate students, maybe undergrads as well, for 3 full-time positions for the entirety of the 2020 election cycle. And what that did was both provide those additional folks for staffing for the year, but also created potential candidates to become local election officials in the future, kind of dealing with something we haven't quite addressed yet during this panel, but the need to replenish the ranks of retiring election officials. Arizona also used an internship program that brought in 50 interns over the summer to help deal with ballot initiatives. And again, found that bringing in those interns actually increased the efficacy of the work. It was done better for less money. And then of course you have a whole pool of ambassadors who go out into the world to share the news about what election administration is really like. And then I know I promised 4, but I collapsed 2 of them. So I'll just go with number 3, which is in jurisdictions, in some jurisdictions in Pennsylvania, the local jurisdictions shared workers. So, basically borrowing folks from other jurisdictions to do similar types of jobs, and also in situations where other local government agencies had workers who weren't as busy, kind of borrowed employees. So those are the different creative ways that states and local jurisdictions have been staffing in the absence of additional official election administration bodies.
If I could hop in real quick, one other thing probably we should mention: technology and automation. We should, as election officials, demand access to the same technology that everyone else has, and we should use that creatively. I think they're doing some cool stuff around petitions in Denver, for example, using iPads and kind of eliminating a lot of the human back-end signature checks that have to be done. So we should absolutely take every opportunity to look at technology and integrate that into our systems and processes to be more efficient.
Great. I want to, as we kind of close up here, I want to pivot. Lisa talked about folks doing work and then going out and singing the praises of what election officials do. I want to talk about, the fact that, it happens after every election cycle. We do seem to, post 2020, have had a lot of election officials decide to leave the field due to some of the issues we've talked about. Some of the things that were talked about earlier. So how do we, and Chris, I maybe want to turn to you as someone who recently left as clerk of a large county, but how do we go about recruiting the next generation of election officials? How do we grow these networks? How do we get people interested in the field, given all the kind of things that we've talked about? Like, how do you convince somebody that, hey, this is still like a really good thing to do, and you should want to take this on? Do you have some thoughts to give us on that front?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, in 2020, the way that many of the initiatives that we brought to bear came about was just from looking at the private sector, right? We looked at McDonald's and Chick-fil-A to figure out drive-through voting. We looked at our grocery stores to figure out how to make things move quicker in our queues. This is no different, right? The way you get somebody to be excited about taking on a career is to offer them that opportunity, to make sure that there are real rewards, that there's a real career path, that you're building out a pipeline when it comes to sort of internships and community relations. But honestly, I don't think there will be a shortage of young people looking to get involved in this. I mean, I think some of these battles that we find ourselves in right now have drawn so much more attention to this job. And I won't say I've been inundated, but I've gotten quite a few calls and emails from young people who are looking to run for county clerk in their counties. But I think we should just follow, the nuts and bolts of, how to get people jazzed about careers in general, which is to make them aware that it exists, to talk about the attractive nature of it, why it's important, to make sure that, again, there's budget there, that folks can come in and have a starting salary that they can support their families, and then that they can see a career path where they can imagine themselves spending 10, 20 plus years.
Great, thank you, Chris. And Justin, I'll turn to you to see if there's anything you'd like to add on that front.
I think Chris, really made some great points. One of those critical factors that he mentioned too was that pipeline of talent, right? And for us, we really value our internship program here within my office, and we've hired interns who have worked with us. And we've also seen other interns go on in other areas within election administration elsewhere. And I think that is so critical as well. And just the reality that, one of the positives we're dealing with right now is that there is engaged interest in this process. We just opened up an interview process recently for a position within our office, and it was remarkable the number of candidates who applied who really did have a passion for, and honestly, a little bit of experience in the field as well, which I think is something that we're seeing shift a little bit, the professionalization of election administration, and that's very encouraging. But I think one of the things we really have to hit on is the resources that are allocated to that. My entire elections division budget is 2% of my county's budget. and that's not uncommon. I think something that report touched on is the average election official salary was something somewhere around 50,000, I believe, which is 20,000 below the average salary of someone else in, the other fields that are similar. And so I think we really do have to focus even locally, local and state governments investing in those resources too.
Great. And Aaron, I don't know, in terms of Ohio, if you've seen kind of the years you've been there, if the kind of turnover post the 2020 election seems to be greater than or kind of on par with prior cycles, but do you have thoughts on like how to get people into this field and how to gain access to that talent to make sure that we have election officials coming in that are, as dedicated as the ones that are choosing to leave?
Sure. I mean, huge brain drain in Ohio. We're losing a lot of people who have been here 30 plus years that are retiring after 2020. So we're not unique in that regard at all. Yeah. I mean, Chris and Justin made pretty much every point I wanted to make, with maybe the exception of one. And I think we need to continue to look, and this is a role we try to play as an association, for professional development and continuing education opportunities. So I love it when I get an email from an election official that's somewhere else in the country and I see CIRA, in their tagline, in their email signature line, just like Chris puts JD next to his. I'm sure, that's a badge we should wear with honor, and we should strive, to professionalize the profession and to teach people, young people coming in this profession, that it's honorable, that it is real. It's a career, it's a profession. It's not the dumping ground of patronage that it might have been, 30 years ago, where, you just needed, the party chairman's nephew needed a job. I'll put him at the Board of Elections. It's like, you can't have that anymore. It's just too important work. It's too difficult work. And we need to look for ways to professionalize. And I think Justin and Chris made some outstanding suggestions along those lines.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. And Lisa, finally, I'll turn over to you on this question. I want to make sure that everybody got a chance to weigh in here, because I think this is a super important question that I think generally we face in elections, but I think after all the issues that came up last year and that we're continuing to see as a result of the 2020 election in terms of threats people are facing and the just kind of increased workload and what seems to be just a lot of turnover, making sure that we're able to recruit people into those positions. And so, Lisa, I want to make sure that I give you an opportunity to weigh in on that as well.
Thanks, Edgardo. Well, first of all, I want to say how happy I am to hear what Chris had to say about the interest of young people in working in elections. It's particularly important to have a pipeline, as everybody has referenced, in light of the statistic that something like 35% of current local election officials are eligible for retirement by 2024. And we know that I think in Pennsylvania, about a third of the election officials have left or retired post 2020. So we are really facing somewhat of a drain of our local election officials. And I kind of want to pause there and again, bring this back to the humanity of our election officials, right? They are the people who are making democracy work on the front line. They are our public servants, and they deserve to have good jobs. These jobs should be workable. They shouldn't have to be working themselves to death. In our interviews, we heard from multiple folks about the inability to take vacation. One local election official who had to put on 4 elections every year had 2.5 years worth of unused vacation time. That's not sustainable, and it makes it a job that is less desirable. We really need to make these jobs better for people so that we can have the competent, amazing election officials that we have had up to this point. I think I have more to say, but I feel like I'm running out of time, so thanks.
Lisa, I think, if you had something additional on that, I think, this is, like I said, I think it's super important question and issue that we're grappling with. So I think if there are kind of additional points, I think the audience would certainly appreciate that.
You're too kind, Edgardo, if you insist. So first I would say, we talked about the ways to create additional capacity and staffing, and I think that's really important. I also think that it's important to try to consolidate election calendars so that folks, because offices are staffed so leanly, people just can't take off. There's nobody to fill in for them. And when you're constantly gearing up for elections and then doing the count and then gearing up for another one, there's just not the time or ability to take off and re-energize. I think those are all really important things in terms of making the job better. And then in terms of recruitment of new folks, there are a lot of things that can be done in conjunction primarily with colleges and universities. There are the internship programs that folks have talked about. There's Democracy Corps that was put into place in Arizona. There are opportunities for undergraduate and graduate certificates through University of Minnesota and Auburn University, and those kinds of programs should be expanded where folks can study election administration, especially since there is this larger interest among young people. I think election officials should try to partner more with poll worker recruitment organizations, right? There was Power the Polls, and I think another one called Poll Hero, which really catalyzed young people to become poll workers in 2020. Those poll workers are a future pool for local election officials. So I think all those things are really important. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to say more.
Thank you, Lisa. And I think we're going to wrap up. This has been a wonderful panel. We could, I think, all of us keep going for hours on these important topics. But Lisa, Justin, Chris, Aaron, I want to thank all of you for all the work that you've done and continue to do on these issues, and for joining us this afternoon on this panel on these very important topics. So thank you all very much. And I think we have some closing remarks from Miles Rappaport. I'm not sure how we will turn that over. There's Miles. So Miles, I think you're going to close us out today. So thank you again to the panelists, and thanks for inviting me to be a moderator of such an amazing group of folks.
Great. Thanks, Edgardo. Thank you for passing it on to me. Listen, I just want to say on behalf of the Ask Center, first of all, thanks to my colleagues at the Brennan Center, at the Bipartisan Policy Center, who have done the really excellent and heavy lifting on this project and produced an excellent report that I hope will get a lot of attention. Also, thanks to the exceptional panelists today, Chris, Lisa, Justin, Aaron, and Edgardo. You did a great job. I learned a lot listening to it, and I think people will as well. But especially I want to thank all of the election officials who are out there doing their job every day, protecting our democracy, operating under difficult circumstances, and really doing a great honor and service to the profession and to the country. Listen, everybody has said, we're in a fraught moment in American democracy with all the misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing, with the legislation to undermine the independence of election officials, and unfortunately, as we have heard, the threats and painful intimidation that many have received. But at the same time, what we have all heard today and what we have seen in 2020, and what I am confident we're going to see in 2022 as well, and 2024, are election officials at every level standing up, doing the right thing, doing their job, making sure our democracy really works. So again, I want to thank everybody for this important project. I urge people to go and encourage other people to go and watch the YouTube video of both sessions because they were really excellent. I certainly want to encourage everyone to read the report and to circulate the report to the maximum degree. It has wonderful, wonderful recommendations in it. And we should be inspired to do our very best, whether we are voters or citizens or advocates or elected officials. We need to set ourselves to the task of protecting and improving American democracy. And if we do that, I think America will be the better for it. So thanks everybody for coming, for being part of today's event. And I appreciate all of you very, very much on behalf of the Ask Center.